It is year 9 of the Parsha podcast, and we are rolling. I want to remind you that we're doing an experiment here on the Parsha podcast starting next week, Tuesday evening, November 5th, which happens to be also the election day, but that's not why we're starting then. We're doing a new experiment where we're doing a live recording of the Parsha podcast. It's going to be on Zoom. It's not for everyone, I understand. It's maybe not something that the introverts, that my people, the introverts, love doing. If you want to join the special live recording of the Parsha podcast, Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Central, you could join, but you could keep your video off and your audio muted. You could be a lurker. But I wanted to try this out. It's maybe a more interactive way of studying. It'd be nice for us to study together, live and in person. I want to clarify, because there was some confusion about this last week. This is going to be in addition to the podcasts, meaning this is just me recording the podcast, not by myself in a room, but together with y'all on Zoom. I'll make sure everyone's on mute so you won't hear any background noise, so it'll sound the same. If you want to listen to the podcasts, your experience will not change at all. But if you want to also join on the Zoom, torchzoom.com, Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Central. I'm going to actually open the Zoom. We'll open the door at 7:30 Central, which is obviously 8:30 Eastern. So if people want to join and just do some chit-chatting or whatever it is, the doors are open at 7:30, torchzoom.com. But the live recording of the Parsha podcast will start at 8, and hopefully we'll have time for questions afterwards as well. So if you want to join, you go to your browser. Is that Chrome or Safari? Or maybe you're still using Firefox, or maybe you're an early adopter and you use Opera or Arc, or maybe you're still using Internet Explorer or Edge. Maybe Microsoft persuaded you to finally download Edge. Just go into the top and put in torchzoom.com, and that's going to automatically send you to the Torch Zoom account. And if you have Zoom installed on your computer or on your phone, it's going to automatically populate. You'll be let in. There's no need to register. None of that nonsense. None of that nonsense. Just pop in and join the live recording of the Parsha podcast Tuesdays at 8 Central, 9 Eastern. Put it in your calendar. Starting next week, Parsha's Lech Lecha. Doors open at 7:30. I hope to see you. Otherwise, we'll just meet in the podcast here on the audio version, and that is totally okay. Now, one quick note before we start. Last week, we spoke about the Chronicles of Adam, and I had mentioned that I wanted to write a newsletter. I wanted to resurrect the moribund newsletter and write a newsletter about the angle on the Chronicles of Adam that I had. Ultimately, I was not able to write it before the festival last week, so I actually recorded it as a podcast on Sunday, so you can check it out. It's not on the Parsha podcast, which is the current show, the one that you listen to right now. It's actually on one of my other shows, This Jewish Life. Fascinating. Very interesting perspective on the book of Adam, the Chronicles of Adam. It's Parshas Noach, and of course, we have the story of the flood. Humanity is getting off to a rough start. We read about Noah. He's righteous. He has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But the people around him are behaving very improperly. There's all sorts of immorality. There is spiritual decay that's affecting not only the humans, but also the animals. And God says, okay, I've given them enough grace period. Noah, go build the ark. Noah builds the ark. It takes him 120 years. We're holding the sources. He assembles all of the inhabitants. They enter the ark. We read about all the rain. They spend the whole year in the ark. You send out the birds, first the raven, 7 days later the dove around 1. The dove goes out again, returns with an olive branch. And then Noah and his family and all the animals depart from the ark. Now, after the whole story of the flood and the whole year, the whole saga in the ark after verse 16 of chapter 8. After God tells Noah to leave the ark, there's still a lot of Parsha left. How much Parsha is left after the whole story of the flood in the ark is finished? So your friend over here counted. There are exactly 99 verses after the instruction to leave the ark before the Parsha ends. If the post-ark part of the Parsha was its own standalone Parsha, it would be a fairly decently sized Parsha. It would be longer than 19 Parshas in the Torah. The average Parsha length is 108 verses. There's lots and lots of narrative after the flood. After Noah leaves, he's told to leave, and he leaves the ark with his wife and his sons and his daughters-in-law, and all the animals leave. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices. And God smells the aroma of the sacrifices, whatever that means. Of course, theologically, God doesn't smell, God doesn't enjoy aromas. Of course, we know that. But God commits to never curse humanity with a flood-like event again. God makes a pledge that there's always going to be seasons. God blesses humanity. He tells them to be fruitful and multiply. God permits humanity to eat meat. Previously, they were prohibited from killing animals to eat them. And God makes the covenant, of course, of the rainbow with humanity. That's a sign that God will never again destroy all flesh with a flood. And then we read some of the, sordid episodes that happened after the flood. Noah wants to repopulate the world, not just the world, but all the different plants and different trees. And he plants a vine. But he debases himself, we're told. He plants a vine, he grows the grapes, he produces wine, he drinks from the wine and becomes drunk with a stupor. And he is assaulted, he is violated by his son Ham, by son Ham. He was naked and he was vulnerable, and his son does something absolutely terrible to him. Different opinions in Rashi, either he castrated him or he sodomized him. Regardless, it's not pretty. And the two other sons, Shem and Japheth, they put a blanket on their shoulders and they walk backwards and they cover the nakedness of their father, trying to restore his dignity. And Noah emerges from his stupor and he recognizes what his son Ham did to him. And he blesses the two sons who concealed his shame, and he curses Ham and Ham's son Canaan. And the parsha proceeds with delineating the many descendants of Noah's sons, and read about the Tower of Babel episode when humanity conspired against God and were scattered and were balkanized. And the parsha ends with the line of Shem, 10 generations from Noah to Abram, soon to be Abraham, of course. And the very end of the parsha read about the family of Abram and his father Terach, and his father's brothers, and his cousins, Lot, and his wife / cousin or / niece, really, Sarah, then called Sarai. They begin this voyage to the land of Canaan. They ultimately don't make it there, at least not everyone in this party. They settle in a place called Haran, and the last verse of the parsha, Terach, father of Abram, dies in Haran. Of course, next week, Parsha Shlach Lecha, we're going to read all about Abram becoming Abraham, traveling to Canaan, and the story continues following exclusively the family of Abram, soon to be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the sons of Jacob, going down to Egypt, and so on. I want to talk a little bit about some of the events that happened after the flood in our Parsha. And the theme of year 9 of the Parsha podcast is that Torah is our ID. Who are we as a people? What do we stand for? What makes Jews Jews? What makes us special? It's the Torah. That's our ID. Please God, every week on the Parsha podcast, we'll have an idea or ideas and a dilemma or a dilemma for our friends who are subjects of the Commonwealth. Today, please God, we'll have 3 ideas on the Parsha, specifically at the end of the Parsha, after the flood, the post-diluvian part of the Parsha, followed by a Parsha dilemma. The first idea revolves around the rainbow. There's a covenant between God and all of humanity. After the flood, after Noah emerges from the ark, after Noah brings sacrifices, God makes a covenant, a pact, a treaty with humanity. Not just with the righteous parts of humanity, with all of humanity. I have placed my rainbow in the cloud, and that's a sign that I'm not going to destroy humanity again via a flood. Now, what's this idea of the rainbow? What is the significance, the symbolism of the rainbow? So there's a very interesting comment here in the Ramban. The Ramban says that a rainbow, it's a bow, and a bow could be a weapon. It's in the shape of a bow. And of course, a bow is a weapon. But it's actually not pointing as if, you're holding a bow. The curved part of it is facing your enemy. And the part where the two ends of it, the two sticks come out, well, that's facing you, the person holding the weapon. The rainbow is a bow that's not facing towards us, it's facing away from us. And that's a sign, says the Ramban, as if heaven is turning its bow away from pointing at us to pointing away from us. And this is similar to enemies, adversaries, contestants, combatants on a war, who typically would face their weapons at each other. But when they want to make a signal of peace, they turn the weapons away from the adversary. Similarly, God, in this sign of the rainbow, he's turning the bow away from us. Now the Ramban adds, this is not to say that the phenomenon of a rainbow, after it rains, sometimes you see a rainbow in the clouds. That's not a phenomenon that happened or that was initiated after the flood. This was an extant phenomenon before the covenant. But it's refashioned into a sign. The Ramban says, scientifically we know this. And he says, textually, if you look at the verse does not say that God declares, I'm going to make a sign, or I'm going to place a rainbow. Rather, he says, the rainbow that I placed in the cloud. Similarly, kashti, which means my rainbow, meaning that's the extant rainbow. So the Ramban proves both scientifically and textually that the rainbow actually preceded this, but now God is saying this rainbow that appears ever since the beginning of creation, it appears in the aftermath of rain, that's now going to be used as a sign of God's commitment to not destroy the world with a flood. Now, the Hasidic masters say something a bit different, and I think it's a very interesting take, a very deep take. They note that a rainbow is a semicircle. It's not a full circle. It's a half circle. And that, they tell us, that's to signify that there's going to be a limitation in the influence of humanity. Meaning, we think of this sign of the rainbow as something which is an unvarnished, unbridled good. God is committing to not destroy us, to not destroy humanity, to not destroy the world ever again. But the Hasidic masters point out that actually there's a reason why God is making this commitment. And that's because God's going to limit the scope of our behavior. We are unique in that we have free will. We have the ability to influence and affect and effectuate the direction of the world and of the universe. God partners with us in determining the fate and the destiny of existence. And if we choose good, well, then good things happen. And if we choose bad, then bad things happen. And the more ability that we have to choose, the larger the scope of our free will, that will determine the larger the potential impact that we have. The more free will someone has, the more impact they can bring about, they can engender. Before the flood, our sages tell us, the Chassid masters tell us, the amount of free will endowed to humanity was much more. It wasn't a semicircle. We could call it a whole circle. And thus they had the ability, both positively and negatively, to do a lot. And therefore, when they made poor choices, the scope, the impact, the blast radius of their bad choices brought about the destruction of the world, effectively. When God is saying, I'm going to make this rainbow, I'm going to give you a half a circle, a semicircle, a crescent, that's indicating that actually the scope of our free will is going to be limited, and that's why the impact of our bad choices is going to be limited as well. So this is, in effect, a diminishment of humanity. Humanity had more power, and therefore the power was, unfortunately, deployed for a negative use, and thus such power deployed in a negative fashion led to the flood. God says, okay, semicircle time, less power. There's a diminishment, a curtailing of our ability to influence, and thus our ability to destroy as well. Perhaps this is part of the reason why lifetimes were severely diminished. The life expectancies were diminished after the flood because humanity was reduced. So this is kind of Noah's covenant. Noah, perhaps we can suggest, this is a deep idea, but we're used to that here on the Parsha podcast. Noah is the savior of humanity. He's the righteous one who survives, who ensures that humanity endures. He was found righteous and worthy, and he entered the ark, and he maintained the perpetuation of humanity. But his impact was kind of limited as well. Noah was told there's going to be a flood. How many people did he bring with him onto the ark? Just his family. And there's even a debate in the sources whether or not his own children entered the ark on their own merit or simply in the merit of their father Noah. Meaning there is an opinion that Noah influenced absolutely no one at all, to become righteous. So Noah is righteous, and he's the savior of humanity, but his impact is also not expansive. It's siloed off. It's his own little sphere. Certainly, Noah was righteous, all right. And he's given a covenant, all right. But it's almost a covenant that matches his contribution. I won't destroy the world, God says, because I'll curb humanity's ability to impact the whole world negatively. And this is a reflection, so to speak, of your limited impact that you had upon the world. Now, by contrast, we know that Abraham, he also merited a covenant. And that's his Parsha. We're going to read how God made a covenant with Abraham, the covenant of the circumcision, of the bris milah. If you understand that on a deep level, you'll see how that covenant augments the power of Abraham and his descendants. Circumcision, after all, it symbolizes the mission of the Jew. The mission of the Jew is to eliminate the reign of the foreign god, of the Yetzer Hara, and to expose and reveal the glorious crown of Almighty God in the world. The bris, the circumcision, this covenant, the covenant of Abraham, it's about affecting, elevating, edifying, transforming the whole world, the whole universe. Abram was told, after all, that the whole world will be blessed through you. Blessing is going to come down from heaven to the world via a pipeline of vitality brought about by Abraham and his descendants. In a way, these two covenants are opposites. Abraham's covenant is telling him, you will have the ability to impact the entire world. You're being excluded from the covenant of Noah. Noah's covenant was you can't impact the whole world, and that's why you're limited upside, and of course limited downside. You can't destroy the world. There's only a semicircle of a sphere of influence for Noah and his cohort. And that's why you can't destroy the whole world. Can't fix it either. Abraham and his descendants are removed from that covenant. And the covenant of Abraham is specifically the opposite. Your impact now can reverberate the world over. And perhaps we could even say that is both for good and for bad. There's a very long tradition of comparing Noah to Abraham. Of course, Rashi, in our Parsha at the very beginning, Rashi does compare Noah to Abraham. And through all the sources, there's almost the father of humanity is Noah. A righteous non-Jew is called a descendant of Noah. They are great people. They're wonderful people. They're people who will not destroy the world. But there's something entirely different about Abraham and his folk. They're the ones who are told specifically, you are not subject to the limitations of Noah's covenant. Your job, in fact, your mission, your mandate is to change the entire world for the better. Now, the second idea relates to the terrible event that happened in the aftermath of the flood. Noah debases himself, drinks from the wine, becomes drunk, is violated by his son Ham. And the verse tells us, chapter 9, verse 23, the two other sons, Shem and Japheth and Japheth, they take the garment and they put it on their shoulders and they walk backwards and they cover the nakedness of their father. If that's where the verse ended, I would know everything that happened. The two sons, they understand that the father's vulnerable. They put the garment on their shoulders and they walk backwards and they cover the nakedness of their father without looking at him in his shame and disgrace. But the verse continues. Ufneim achoranis, and their faces are facing the opposite direction. Ve'erva savim lo ra'u, and the nakedness of their father they did not see. So we're told that they were facing away and they didn't see the nakedness of their father. Now you read this verse, it makes 100% sense. They're facing the direction. They don't see his nakedness. But of course, I know if you tell me someone's facing the opposite direction, I know they don't have eyes behind their heads. If they are facing the other direction, of course they don't see the nakedness of their father. So there's a little bit of a textual redundancy here in the verse. They're facing the other direction, and they don't see the nakedness of their father. Well, if they're facing the direction, we know for sure they don't see the nakedness of the father. What is the Torah telling us extra? So Sages tell us that there's a deep lesson over here. There's a lesson about the greatness of these two brothers. And by contrast, the wickedness of Ham, the father of Canaan, who exploited his father. When someone is naked, they're exposed, they're vulnerable. That could be, of course, physically or in any area. We all have areas of vulnerability, areas where we can be exploited. We all have shortcomings. We all have gaps. None of us are angels. What happens when you encounter someone else's vulnerability? When you discover someone else's weakness, the nerve points of another person. What do you focus on? Do you choose to dwell upon their nakedness, their vulnerabilities? Or maybe do you look at the positivity and the qualities that they have? Ham, we're told, verse tells us, he saw his father's nakedness and he exploited him. When Ham saw Noah's a mixed bag, right? On one hand, the Torah tells us that he was righteous. The Torah testifies he was righteous. Noah was righteous. Period. End of story. But he's also naked here. And what does Ham see? He sees his father's nakedness. He doesn't even see the qualities. These two brothers, the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth, they're facing backwards. So obviously they didn't see the father's nakedness. But the Torah testifies that not only were they facing the direction, the nakedness of the father they did not see. There's two reasons why they didn't see their father's shame. Yes, they chose to look elsewhere. But also, they were trained to not see the flaws and the vulnerabilities and the shortcomings of others. Whereas Ham saw only the vulnerability, Shem and Japheth, they only saw the good. I think this is a very important lesson. The sources tell us a memorable story. There were two people who encountered a stinking, putrid, rotting carcass of a dead animal. And the fool said, "Oh, how disgusting, how revolting, how putrid this awful carcass of an animal." That's what the fool said. But the sage said, "But look how white are its teeth." And this story is there to teach us how we should always be on the lookout for the positive. Every person, every single person in the world is a mixed bag. Everyone has qualities that are admirable, and everyone has flaws that are very, very unimpressive. And whether or not you like a person and you value a person and you see benefit in a person and you can admire a person, it only depends upon you. Righteousness is in the eyes of the beholder. Every person is righteous in some area, in some dimension. Everyone is wise and talented and gifted in some dimension. The question is, what do you choose to focus on? Are you Ham-like in that you just find the negative and that's all you see? We see a different way to do it. We see a way that's praised in the Torah, that's blessed in the Torah. That's to not focus on that. Maybe not to ignore it. You don't want to make a deal with a crook, of course. You don't have to be stupid. But it's not what you focus on. It's not what you're looking at. It's not what you're scrutinizing. We are all familiar with the personality type, the shark, who always finds the vulnerabilities of everyone and everything that they encounter. LBJ, he could sniff out, we're told, in the biographical literature. He could sniff out a person's precise area of vulnerability and weakness with precision. And he would zone in on that and endlessly exploit it. That's a bit of a Ham quality. The Talmud tells us that you're supposed to dance by weddings. And you're supposed to dance in front of the bride. And you're supposed to declare how beautiful this bride is and how righteous she is. And the sages said, well, that's great, but what if she ain't that pretty? What if she's blind? And what if she's, God forbid, lame? What do you say about such a bride? And the other sages respond, you say she's so pretty and she's so righteous. But isn't that a lie? The answer is that no, there's good in everyone and in everything. Our job is to focus on that and to not see and seek the bad. And this is the way, this is the virtue of Shem and Japheth. Whereas the other way of doing things, to find their vulnerability and to try to exploit it, to see the nakedness and to zone in on it, that is the execrable quality of Ham. And for that, he was cursed and forever remains cursed. And this brings us to the third idea of this week's Parsha podcast. You know, if you read the sections of the Torah end of Parshas Bereshis, end of Parshas Noach, they just run through genealogy. It seems like a throwaway section. You read it very fast. Let's get to the next piece of action, next personality, next narrative, next storyline. I saw something very interesting about the descendants of Ham. Chapter 10, verse 6. We just read 4 sons of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, and Canaan. And then it tells us the descendants of Cush and Mitzrayim, Phut, apparently did not have descendants, or at least not descendants that spawn nations, and the descendants of Canaan read as well. And I want to present this idea that I saw with the following angle. You think about what the world looked like after the flood. Before the flood, it was full of evil and corruption, and there was no area of the world that was not impacted by the devolvement of humanity. But after a year in the ark and all the purging of evil, the world was cleansed. And it raises the question, if Noah, who was righteous, he survived with his family, where's the corruption from? If all corruption was purged, why is there still corruption today? This is the question the Kabbalists ask. And the answer, of course, has to do with one of Noah's sons, Ham. He had 4 sons, we're told. Cush, Mitzrayim is Egypt, Phut, and Canaan, of course, the land of Canaan. These all spawned nations. Now, if you read these names, these are names that appear elsewhere in the Torah. Of course, Mitzrayim, that appears all over the Torah. Egypt. Abraham goes to Egypt. Isaac is told not to go to Egypt. Jacob descends to Egypt. Joseph goes to Egypt. The nation spends a lot of time in Egypt, hundreds of years in Egypt. And then there's the whole Exodus from Egypt. Egypt is referenced many, many, many times. In fact, even the Exodus from Egypt is mentioned 50 times in the Torah. So Mitzrayim, Egypt, that's a son of Ham. And the origin, so to speak, of everything Egypt is here. And of course, one of his other sons is Canaan. And you could argue that really the whole storyline of the Torah, it's a story of Egypt and Canaan. We start off, we go to Egypt, and we try to get out of Egypt and go to Canaan. And the nation, the end of the Torah, the nation is on the doorstep of entering Canaan. And Moshe wants to cross over the Jordan and enter Canaan and to capture and settle the land of Canaan. It's almost like the storyline of the Torah very much orients around the sons of Ham. You recall perhaps a verse in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 3. The nation is told that we are prohibited to mimic the behavior of the land of Mitzrayim, Egypt, and the land of Canaan. And Rashi tells us that the worst people in the world are the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, meaning worse spiritually, the Egyptians, and the Canaanim, the Canaanites. And these are all descendants of Ham. All the corruption that happens in the world, it all stems from Ham and his sons. So I'll tell you what I saw in the Kabbalistic literature. I like this idea a lot because it gives so much richness to what would have otherwise been just a boring read through names and people. We don't know who these people are, just running through this whole genealogy. It's kind of boring. But the Kabbalists tell some fascinating ideas. The Kabbalists tell us that the serpent of Genesis, that's the Yetzer Hara, that's evil. It has 4 dimensions of impurity. Klipot in the Kabbalistic parlance. And they are represented by Ham's 4 sons, Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, and Canaan. Kabbalistically, we're told that these are all vestiges of Cain. It's hinted in the Gematria. Cain is Gematria 140. The first letter of these 4 names is also 140. That's interesting, but that gives us some more color, some more context. to Ham and his sons. Now, the Kabbalists tell us further that there was a person whose life mission was to wage a war against the evil that stems from Ham and his 4 sons. That man's name is Moshe. That was his life's mission, to eradicate from the world any remnant, any leftover, any vestiges of the influence of Ham. Of course, we know Moshe had some very well publicized actions in the land of Egypt, in Mitzrayim. But did you know that Moshe spent time in the land of Cush? And his 4 sons, Cush, Mitzrayim, Phut, and Canaan. The sources talk about this extensively. It's only hinted to very vaguely in the scripture. But Moshe spent a lot of time in a land called the land of Cush. That's the nation that came from this Cush, son of Ham. You recall perhaps the beginning of the book of Exodus. Moshe, he is a prince of Pharaoh, and he goes out to visit with his brethren who are slaves, and he sees an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man, and he kills the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. The next day he tries to intervene with 2 Hebrews who were fighting, and they say, oh, you're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? So Moshe is found to be a murderer because he killed the Egyptian, and he's wanted for murder, but he escapes. And the verse tells us that he goes to Midian, and he goes to the well, and he sees Jethro's daughters who were being harassed, and he ends up marrying one of them, Zipporah, and then he has the burning bush episode, ends up in Egypt. We know the whole story. But according to the Midrash, and again, this is hinted to vaguely in scripture, as I will tell you in a bit, before Moshe went to Midian, he went to Cush, and actually spent a long time there, 40 years. And it's a very long and dramatic story. He arrives in Cush, and there's a war. The Cushites had a war against some other kingdom. They got back. They actually won the war, but they returned to Cush, but the city had been taken over. There were usurpers in Cush, and they had actually conquered the city. So one nation goes to war outside the city. They come back, and the city is gone. It's been taken over. It's been hijacked by usurpers. And it's a very long narrative in the Midrash. I'll give you just the highlights. All 4 sides were inaccessible. There were massive walls, and there was a moat, and on one side there was actually enchanted snakes that made it impenetrable, impregnable. So the Cushites are laying siege to their own city. And Moshe arrives there in the middle of the siege, and he joins the Cushites and their king, a guy named Kotnus. I think that's how you pronounce it. And Moshe is very powerful, and he's a mighty warrior. And the king was so enchanted by Moshe, he makes him an advisor. And for years, Moshe's there, and they're laying siege to their own city. And after 9 years of siege, this king of the Cushites dies, and they need a replacement. And they appoint Moshe as their king, Moshe, the king of the Cushites. And they said, to demonstrate that you're a real king of the Cushites, we're going to give you the widow of the former king, the one who died. So Moshe's coronated. He's the king of the Cushites. And the very next day, he comes up with a plan to conquer the city. They tell him, go to the forest. This is his advice. And find a fierce bird called a chasida, but find a small chasida bird. They raise these birds, and after they have these big birds, Moshe tells his army, each one has one of these birds, to not give any food to your bird for 2 days. Make them really hungry. And on day 3, the birds are famished. They take him to the side of the city that was covered with these snakes that made it impenetrable. He says, now it's okay. Now we're taking these birds and we're unleashing them on these snakes. And these ravenously hungry birds came and just attacked all these snakes and ate them all up and opened up the door to the city. And they entered the city of Cush and they conquered it. Cush was once again restored to the Cushites and their king, Moshe, king of the Cushites. And we're told there were no casualties in this ingenious plot to enter the city. And Moshe enters the city and he rules over the Cushites, and the usurpers had to flee. And now that Moshe is secure as the king, they give him this Cushite wife, again, the widow of the recently departed king. And Moshe marries her. But Moshe doesn't really marry. He pretends. Externally, he pretends to marry her. He doesn't want to marry someone from the family of Ham. He knows that this is a cursed family. He doesn't want to marry them. But he pretends to. And for years, Moshe leads this kingdom with great skill. He suppresses rebellion, and he's revered for his wisdom and his righteousness, and he's honored and glorified in this kingdom. He's a ruler for 40 years. After 40 years, Mrs. previous king, Moshe's nominal wife, she lets the cat out of the bag. Moshe didn't really marry me. Oh, and by the way, he doesn't worship our gods. And Moshe was banished, but because they revered him so much, they gave him lots of gifts, and they honored him. And Moshe left, and then he went to Midian. That's a story that we're told in many sources in the Midrash. The whole backstory of Moshe that is, again, only hinted to in the Torah. Where it's hinted in the Torah? In the end of Parsha Ba'aloscha, in the book of Numbers, chapter 12, it tells a story of when his sister spoke Lashon Hara, evil talk against Moshe, and she got saras for that. And what was the nature, the content of her slander against Moshe? It was regarding the Cushite woman that he married, that he took. That's a reference to this woman, to this queen, I guess, of the Cushites that Moshe pretended to marry. That's the story. Moshe spent a lot of time with the Cushites. And the Kabbalists tell us, so why did Moshe, when he had to escape Egypt, why did he go to Cush? What's he trying to accomplish? They tell us Moshe's life mission was to eradicate the forces of Ham. And he's going to Cushite, to the Cushites, to the land of Cush. He's setting out to uproot the noxious effects of Ham, and he started off with Cush. And after 40 years, Moshe, greatest man who ever lived, he is cleansing them. He is engaged through in the process of spiritual cleansing and purification. Maybe they weren't quite purified, but the forces of Ham, the deadly forces of Ham, the deadly spiritual forces of Ham, were being suppressed, were being quieted, mitigated, attenuated by Moshe. And then Moshe goes back to Egypt. And we know what happened there. He quiets, suppresses, neutralizes the forces of Ham as manifested in Egypt. Now we know Moshe was very desirous of entering the land of Canaan. He prayed incessantly to be allowed to enter. Our sages tell us 515 prayers. And the Torah repeatedly tells us that he was thwarted. He was not to enter. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, the very last words that God tells Moshe is that you want to cross the Jordan, V'shama lo sa'avar, there you shall not cross. Moshe wanted to knock out all the sons of Ham, cleanse them all, and bring the world towards its perfection. Now, when I first heard this idea, I wondered, wait a minute, we have 4 sons of Ham. Cush, we know Moshe spent a lot of time in Cush. Mitzrayim, Egypt. Phut, and Canaan. And Moshe has extensive documented interactions with 3 of them. But what about Phut, the 4th one? How was that element of Ham destroyed? I really like this question. Where is Moshe's interaction with foot? I liked it. I got a kick out of it. What do you think about this question? Does it have legs? Now, on the heels of this question, I did some investigation and I found some ideas. So let's dip our toe into it. Where did Moshe deal with foot? The sources tell us that for 40 years in the wilderness, Moshe was not negligent in his mission, his life mission of eradicating the forces of Ham in the world. In the Midbar, in the wilderness, in the desert, there is a spiritual force, the force of foot. And the Kabbalists tell us, you look at the Gematria foot, it's 95. It's the same as Haman. Haman's a little bit of this influence. And the Chelbana, that nasty part of the Ketores. For 40 years, Moshe was in Cush. For 40 years, he was in the wilderness. Perhaps for 40 years, he was in Egypt as well. He spent 40 years knocking out 3 out of 4. In his lifetime, Moshe had quelled 3/4 of Ham's influence. And the prize was the final part of that quartet. Canaan. When they are quieted, if the influence of Ham is entirely defeated or suppressed, at least, in the world, that moment will bring about the next epic of history, what we call the Messiah. Moshe was so desirous of entering Canaan because he knew what that meant. He knew that meant that he'll have another stab at this, a stab at finishing the job, 4 out of 4, eliminating the forces of Canaan, the spiritual, not just forces of Canaan, getting rid of the influence of Ham from the world. And that would bring about the Messiah. And by the way, there's a name for the Messiah. Many Jewish sources. It's known as the Kates. Kates is Gematria 190, which is the same Gematria as Canaan. You want to bring about the Kates, the end of days, so to speak, end of this world, this epoch of history. You want to bring about the Messiah, you got to eliminate the forces of Canaan. Now, the sources that I saw talking about this, there's all sorts of other ideas and connections and Gematrias. But to me, this was a fascinating idea. As a part of the Torah, we read, the sons of Noah, and he has 3 sons, and each one of the sons has all sorts of other sons. Oh, and Ham, who causes all these problems, he's the troublesome one. He has these 4 sons, and these are their children, and so on. When you get a little window into some of the deeper sources, some of the more esoteric sources, we discover how these 4, this quartet, this encapsulates the forces of evil in the world. And each one is a nemesis that needs to be defeated. And Moshe was so determined to do it. And he spent his life doing this important work, defeating each nemesis one at a time. And he was determined to enter Canaan and to finish the job, to finish the quartet. I found that interesting. I don't know how actionable it is. We like to have ideas here that are also lessons. Maybe it's a neat framework, but certainly it's a compelling and intriguing concept to think about and to ponder. I don't know exactly what we can do to eliminate the forces of Canaan, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed this idea. I enjoyed the study of the sons of Ham. I found it interesting, and therefore I put it on the Parsha podcast. But now we're done with the 3 ideas. Let's get to this dilemma. Noah curses Ham for what he did. Well, what did he do? Rashi gives us two opinions. He either castrated him or he sodomized him. Very inappropriate behavior, either one of them. And Noah discovered what happened after he woke up, and he ostracized his son. He levied a permanent curse upon him. Was this the right course of action for Noah? When you compare what Noah did to his son when his son did something unconscionable with what Abraham did to his son when his son did something unconscionable, we find that there's a difference. Ishmael did something very, very problematic. And again, this is in a couple of weeks. We'll read about it. Rashi says there's 3 opinions to what exactly he did. It was either idolatry, adultery, or murder. All terrible things. Abraham banished him. He takes him and his mother Hagar, sends him away. But Abraham didn't want to do it. Notwithstanding the terrible crime of Ishmael and the risk that Ishmael posed to Abraham's true heir, Isaac, Abraham didn't want to send his son away. That's what Sarah recommended, and God tells Abraham, heed Sarah. So Abraham did it. But Abraham seems to have a very different attitude as to what to do when a son does something very, very, very wrong. And the sources tell us that Abraham maintained his relationship with his son, Ishmael. Even though he went to Egypt, he became a hunter. They got together again on occasion. Ishmael was kept in the fold. Abraham did not curse him. Even when he banished him, he did it reluctantly. And ultimately, Ishmael repented. There was a reclamation project for Ishmael. Could something like that have been done by Noah for Ham? Now, you could argue that maybe what Ham did was worse than what Ishmael did. But this is a very serious dilemma. What to do when children, God forbid, do absolutely inappropriate things? Is there ever a point at which cutting all ties, permanently cursing them, is appropriate? Did Noah do the right thing? This is a serious dilemma, the dilemma of Noah. It's something to think about, something to consider, something to mull over, something to finish this week's Parsha podcast with. Next week, we're going to have the inaugural edition, please God, of the Parsha Podcast Live. If you're not interested in joining the Torch Zoom next week, Tuesday night, election night at 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern, nothing about your Parsha Podcast experience will change. It's still going to be the podcast. Everything will be the same. We'll just, when I will be recording it, there's also going to be people on Zoom. And we'll chat before and we'll chat after that. You want to join? Put in your calendar, torchzoom.com. Join us. Hope to see y'all, maybe yes, maybe no, regardless. Send me an email, rabbi@wolverhampton.com. Have a wonderful day. Have a splendid rest every week. Have an uplifting and meaningful and healthful and inspiring and invigorating Shabbos upcoming. And please don't without the money. We'll talk again next week. Maybe, just maybe, live and in person. Email address is rabbi@wolverhampton.com.